In this lesson, we'll start to talk about some of the render settings that are necessary for outputting our final sequence. Okay, so we have now our final render, which is pretty much ready to go. So essentially now, with everything set up the way it is, this is what we're going to get for our final output. Now, what we've been doing up to this point is just rendering a single image into the render viewer. Now, when it comes to rendering out an entire animation, the process is a little bit different. There's several additional steps that we have to go through. Now, before we start to concern ourselves too much with that, there is one really important thing that we need to make sure that we do. And that is, if you recall from one of our earlier lessons, we had taken the in-particle cache and we had deleted those caches so that way we could make adjustments to things like the color and opacity so that we could fine-tune those particles to work with our new light setup. Now, the problem is that Maya, when it comes to working with these dynamic systems, it's calculating these on the fly, so you can't just simply scrub through your scene. You'll notice that every time I do, it looks completely different. So Maya has to be able to calculate these particles on the fly. Now, that starts to become a problem because what that means is that it's very unlikely that Maya is going to make these particles look exactly the same way 2 times in a row. And so that gets to be a real problem if we have to, let's say, render half of our scene at one point and then maybe render the other half of our scene on another system or at another point in time. Well, because these two dynamic systems are calculated on the fly, that means at the point where they join, we're probably going to see a jump because the dynamics calculated on this half of the scene was a different result from this half. So the way that we get around that is by caching our particle results. We store all that information and then we tell Maya to only read that stored data instead of trying to calculate it on the fly. That's how we ensure that we get the exact same result time after time after time, but we can only do this once we've basically finalized our particle setup. So let's go back and reestablish our cache. Let's select our in particle. We'll go to the in dynamics menu. Let's go to in cache and create a new cache. We'll give this just a minute to finish out. Okay, very good. Now let's do the same for our second particle system. Make a new cache. Okay, very nice. So now that is complete. So now with the cache, you can see I can scrub through and we always get the same result each and every time. We no longer have to worry about some sort of a inexplicable jump if we had to render, let's say, different segments of this scene at different points in time, or maybe on different systems, which is a very common thing to have to do. Okay, so now that we have our particles set up and ready to go, cached up, let's now jump into our render settings and let's talk about some of the things that we'll need to start adjusting for our final output. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is inside of MetalRay, we're going to jump into the Common tab. Now, this is where we start to control a lot of the settings as far as the actual output itself and where our images are going to go. So if you look up at the very top, we have this path. Now, this is basically telling us where our final animation is going to render to. So it's going to render it inside your project, inside the images directory. Now, there are a few things that we have to change. This is going to tell us basically what the final output is going to be. So it's going to render by default just a single frame. In this case, it's whatever frame we happen to be on. Or in this case, it's actually using the scene name. So 103 begin happens to be the name of this scene file, of this Maya file. So we need to come in and give this some sort of a file name. So let's say we want to call this robot render. Okay, so now that is going to be the name of the image that gets rendered into this images directory. Now, I don't necessarily want a single image. I actually want an entire sequence. So, what we have to do is change this. Right now, this is going to just render out a single frame. We want this to render out a multi-frame sequence. So, we want to switch this to name, number, extension. Now, this is something really important to keep in mind. When it comes to working in Maya, and specifically when working with MetalRay, we actually don't even have the ability to render out this animation as a movie file. We can't render this out as an AVI. We cannot render it out as a QuickTime. We cannot render it out as any sort of a video-based media. we have to render this out as a series of individual images. So what we're going to wind up with is basically, in my case, we have 300 frames total in this timeline. So whenever we finish rendering, we're going to wind up with 300 individual images. Now that sounds like a pain, and that might sound like a mess, but that's actually a very, very smart way to render. Because what would happen is if we did have the ability to render this all out as a single AVI, let's say we get halfway through the render and then the render fails, Maya crashes, the power goes out, whatever the case may be. Well, that AVI file or that movie file won't actually finish generating until the render is complete. So what's going to happen is it spent all this time rendering and then the file did not actually finish generating. So you're going to wind up having wasted all that time rendering all of this stuff that you could never use. You're going to have to start the render all over again and hope that the same thing doesn't happen. Now, when we're rendering individual images, that's not a problem at all because each file gets written out one frame at a time. So I can render this through, and then again, if something happens, the power goes out, Maya crashes at frame 160, I still have 160 individual images that have been written out into this directory, which is great because now I can just pick the render back up at frame 160 and continue on. I never have to worry about losing any work. So that's why, even though it might seem like kind of a pain and kind of a hassle to have an image file for every single frame, that's absolutely the smartest way to render. So what we want to do is choose the format that we want to render out to, and we have a choice of a bunch of different common and a few special file formats. We have our basic TIFF, JPEG, Targa, Bitmap, and a few other specialized ones here as well. For my sake, I usually find that a Targa image is a pretty good one to go with. It offers a good kind of mixture between high quality but not just an enormous file size. Okay, now one last thing that we can do in this lesson before we finish up this little section is we have our output directory, which is the images folder. We have our image named. You can see robot_render, and then we're going to wind up with 0001. That indicates the frame number. This is basically showing us where the render is going to start and where it's going to end. So you can see we start at frame 1 and end at frame 10. Now that's controlled down here in the frame range. So we don't want it to end at frame 10, we want it to end at frame 300, which is the end of our timeline. So we're going to set the end frame to 300. And now you can see up here, we're going to start rendering at frame 1 and finish rendering at frame 300. So we're going to wind up with now 300 different Targa files inside this images directory. Now, it might seem a little bit strange, but again, I think this will make a little bit more sense and become a little bit more clear when you actually see this starting in our next lesson. So for now, we have our output directory set, we have our start file set, and our end file, and Maya will write out everything between here, the start file and the end file. We've set our output name number extension, which is the important part that lets Maya know that we're actually going to be rendering out more than one single frame. And we've set our output image format. Now there's still a few things that we need to do inside this render settings window before we're ready to actually go through our final rendering process. So we'll do that final little check in our next lesson.